We're just waiting for the link to be posted on Slack.
You can turn your video on, Amesh. It's live.
We can start.
A very good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this second plenary at the Student Conference on Conservation Science, Bangalore 2022. And we're thrilled to have with us Professor David Haskell. And I would like to request Dr. T.R. Shankaraman to please introduce him to all of us.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. David George Haskell, who's delivering the plenary today. Dr. Haskell is an accomplished biologist and one of the finest writers we have today who's writing about the natural world. He has a BA from the University of Oxford and a PhD from Cornell University. He's a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, a Guggenheim Fellow, and William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Biology and Environmental Studies at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. Over his career, I learned that he has studied a range of different taxa, from invertebrates and snails to birds and ferrets and trees, and covering many topics that are of interest to conservation, urbanization, fragmentation, and land use change, among other things. But besides his work as a biologist, he's also very well known for his writing. His first book was called The Forest Unseen, which was a remarkable book and a Pulitzer Prize finalist that spoke about all that you can learn by just observing even 1 square meter of earth in an old growth forest. And it's a lovely book. And he kind of outdid himself on that one with his the books that came later, including this book called The Songs of Trees, a lovely book on the role of trees as nature's great connectors. He's also written a work called The 13 Ways to Smell a Tree, and his most recent book is called Sounds Wild and Broken, which he will be talking about today, and which has also been called as a glorious guide to the miracle of life's sound. Dr. Haskell's work is an eloquent song to nature in all its beauty and complexity. And it's noteworthy for the deep attention that he brings to whatever he writes about. And his writing has led to a number of accolades and awards, including the National Academy's Best Book Award, the John Burroughs Medal, the Iris Book Award, the National Outdoor Book Award for Natural History Literature, and so on. And what I find most interesting and fascinating in his work is that he brings a beautiful blend of science and observation with much deeper sense of reflections on the natural world. And I think there is a message there that there's a lot that we can learn through observation and measurement, but there's also a lot we can learn through contemplation of the natural world. So I hope that after his talk today, many of you will feel inspired to go out and read his books. They are really wonderful works, and I'm also looking forward to hearing him speak today. On to you, Dr. Haskell. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to meet you, Dr. T.R. Shankaraman. I hope we can meet him in person one of these days. I'm very grateful to you for that very kind and generous introduction. And it's an honor to join you all here at the Student Conference on Conservation Science. And I send my greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, where I'm located now, where the sun is just rising in the horizon. So I say good evening, but also good morning, and send my greetings. I'd like to offer my thanks to the conference organizers for the invitation for me to join you in this session, but more importantly for gathering us all here together to learn from one another and to move forward with the exciting science and practices and cause of conservation. Meeting online in this way allows people from a wide geographic area to join together in a practice of speaking and listening that knits us together in the culture of conservation, and therefore allows us to learn, to be inspired by the ideas and the practices of others, and also to share our own work. And that is the stuff of culture, that is the stuff of life, and it takes a huge amount of work to create this kind of conference. So I want to offer my very deep thanks to the organizers for creating that possibility for all of us. And particularly for conservation science, which of course serves a higher purpose, and that is to understand the living earth and thus enable us to be better members of life's community. And that community includes the many other species that we share the earth with, and particularly importantly, the vitality of the human earth community. And today I'm going to offer some thoughts on how listening might help us to understand and conserve this living earth community. I'll draw examples both from very deep time and from ages past, and also from the present moment. Let me start, though, by stating that what we call listening takes many forms. We, each of us individually, differ in how we perceive the vibrations of the world, and our bodies also have multiple different ways of listening to this world. For many people, but not for all, the ear is the primary site of hearing. There, tiny bones and membranes convert vibrations in air around us, sound vibrations, to vibrations in the fluid inside inner ears, inside tubes inside the inner ear. This fluid is salty. It's a remnant of the ancient seawater in which our ancestors evolved, and we carry it still within our inner ears. And there, these vibrations stimulate hair cells that then send signals to the brain. But every ear is different. Some can pick up vibrations from about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And a hertz is a sound wave per second. So this range is about the range of frequency from a very, very low bass drum to the highest pitch squeal we could imagine. So that's the widest range possible for humans. But others among us perceive only the lowest frequencies, or the low and the mid-range. My hearing, for example, cuts off in the mid-ranges, and I can't hear the very highest frequencies that many other people can. And a few of us are sensitive across all insensitive across all frequencies to vibrations in air, at least through the inner ear. And of course, remember that no human ear hears as wide a range as that of most other mammals. Our cats and dogs can hear up to 30, 40, 50, 60,000 hertz. So they're hearing up into what we call the ultrasound, but for them it's just sound. There's nothing ultra about it. We also detect sound, and therefore hear, in our flesh, especially in our fingertips, where about 10 different nerve receptors pick up vibrations. Some of these nerve receptors pick up high frequency vibrations, others low pulses, and this sensation of vibration in our fingertips merges with the sensation of touch, and therefore gives lie to the idea that the senses are separate from one another. Touch and hearing are in fact closely related to one another in our fingertips. In our ears, the sense of motion of our bodies is closely related to the sense of hearing. And so, although it's a convenience to categorize the senses into different clear categories, sight and hearing and touch and proprioception, in fact, within our bodies, they're integrated and they merge within one another. Within our chests, we pick up very low frequencies of sound, and you may have had this experience being close to low bass drums or the rumble of thunder, or even when loud music from a concert is happening and you hear it in the distance, all you hear is the low frequencies, and you hear it within your body more than through your ears. So I encourage you to try listening with your bodies in a multiplicity of ways. Rest your hand on a tree trunk when the tree is being agitated by the rain or wind. Or in an urban setting, rest your hand on the tree trunk when a big a lorry is passing by, and you'll feel how the motion of the vehicle actually makes the tree move. And we know from tree physiology that encourages a different form of wood growth, a stronger form of wood growth than a tree that is not agitated in this way. Attend to the senses in your chest when you're hearing music, and remember that hearing happens throughout the body. So listening is a single word that in fact represents a multiplicity of experiences. Our dominant cultures, though, often assume that we can all hear with a wide range of sensitivities. And this, unfortunately, excludes many people. Part of the practice of listening, then, I think, must be building a society in which all forms of human hearing are welcome and accepted. And to help with this, I've made a written version of this talk available in the chat. There's a link in the Slack chat to a written version of this talk for those for whom listening through the ears on the computer is more challenging. And the link takes you to a transcript on my website. So now, I invite you to cast your minds back into deep time, into ancient years, billions of years ago, and to ask, where did sound come from? And what might we learn from these sounds, both ancient and modern? Well, it turns out that sound is older than planet Earth, older even than the atoms that are all around us in the universe now. In the primordial plasma of the universe, this was a time when the universe was much, much smaller than it is now. It was compressed and extremely, extremely hot. So hot that atoms couldn't form. Protons and electrons swarmed together in something like a hot soup or a lava. It was so dense that light itself was trapped. Photons were trapped within this lava. So we have this incredibly dense early universe. And within it, we have the first sound waves. These are pressure waves flowing through the plasma. Because all sound is, whether sound is in air or in water, or flowing through solid matter like a tree, or if sound is flowing through the pre-atomic world of the early cosmos. Sound is a series of pressure waves, areas of compression, areas of rarefaction, higher pressure, lower pressure. Within the primordial plasma, there were irregularities and sound waves were flowing through this. Now, as the universe then expanded and cooled, this lava-like furnace cooled down and atoms formed. Protons could join to electrons and form things like hydrogen atoms. The first elements were born. And as they did this, they retained the mark of the sound waves that had flowed through the dense plasma before. And amazingly, these wave marks are discernible still to this very day as, first of all, as irregularities in the cosmic microwave background radiation that flows around the universe and through us at all times. The waves also left their mark in the spacing of atoms within the universe. The atoms from the plasma at the peak of sound waves were squashed together. That's what the peak of a sound wave is. It's a place where whether it's air, water, matter, or plasma is a little compressed. That compression remained as the atoms formed. And the spaces in between, there weren't many atoms that formed. Those are the troughs of the waves. And those clusters of atoms became the seeds around which the first stars in the universe were born. Because the atoms were close together, they were drawn closer and closer together by the convivial force of gravity. Gravity drew them together, and then they drew in more atoms and more and more. And bit by bit, and this process took millions of years, but bit by bit, the atoms clustered together and then formed stars, which then formed galaxies. And now, when astronomers scan through the sky and measure the distance between galaxies, they find that there's a regularity there. This is the remnant of the waves from the early cosmos. Galaxies are on average about 500 million light years apart from one another. Not 300, not 400, not 600, but on average about 500. And that is a mark of a remnant, if you like, a memory of the earliest sound waves in the cosmos. So when we look up at the stars at night, we see the remnants of the universe's first sounds. Now, what does this have to do with conservation? Such stories from ancient times predate the formation of our solar system and the evolution of life. I think the message we can learn from these stories from the early cosmos is this. From its origins in the early universe, sound was a generative, creative force. Sound waves quite literally formed the seeds around which the first stars formed, and they sculpted the shape of the background radiation of the universe. And that creative power continues to this day. Of course, within ecosystems, sound's creative power takes a very different form than it did in the hot plasma of the early universe, but the principle is the same. Now, planet Earth then formed more than 4 billion years ago, and then life evolved on this planet shortly afterwards. And when life evolved, the creative capacity of sound continued and indeed expanded, connecting living beings one to another and opening possibility. That connection from one creature to another, as I'm doing now, and as the crickets that are singing in the bushes outside the house here are doing, one calling to another, all of those connections create possibility and allow the continuation of life. For many living beings, both in the past and in the present, sound is one of the primary means of communication from one individual to another. And in every realm of biology, we're now learning that connection is the stuff of life. When I was an undergraduate, we had a different view. We were taught that life was very atomistic. It was all about the individual gene, the individual organism, the individual species. And that's a powerful and very useful way of looking at the world. But it's also limited, because we can't understand the function of a gene without understanding that that gene's function emerges only through community, through the gene's interactions with the other genes around it and the other genes within the entire genome. An individual, like my body, goes by an individual name. It has an individual point of birth and death, but is in fact a living community. Because we now know that my body is comprised, and yours, all human bodies are comprised of human cells, but also as many or more, sometimes 10 times as more, bacterial cells, but also fungi and little mites and viruses and even archaea in our guts, and sometimes nematodes growing on and within us. We are walking communities. We are nodes within a much larger network. And so the individual is just a temporary manifestation of something much older, much deeper, and much more persistent, and that is connection and community. So the stuff of life is relationship. What we try to conserve as conservation scientists and conservation practitioners is interconnection. And interconnection, of course, comes in many forms, but sound, for many creatures, particularly many arthropods and vertebrates, sound is a primary means of social interconnection, and therefore is the very stuff of life. When sound connects two singing animals, it opens up possibilities. By linking these animals into communicative networks, these networks increase life's creativity, diversity, and resilience. And so, a story from the physics of the early universe has direct relevance to conservation, I think, in the 21st century. Sound connects, and sound is thus creative. We understand this well in our own species. After all, sonic communication as spoken language is one of the primary means that human culture forms. But this is also true for non-human beings. I think of sound as a neurotransmitter within ecosystems, an invisible link between beings, one that acts almost instantaneously and at a great distance. And I should, at this point, note that the conference has a workshop on bioacoustics. Those of you with an interest in diving deep into the science here, I encourage you to attend that workshop. So, what can we learn from the first days of sonic evolution on this planet? Well, it turns out that sonic communication, that is, one animal communicating to another through a song or a call, in a way that's familiar to us today through the sounds of insects and birds and mammals, this took a very long time to evolve on this planet. A shockingly long time. All single-celled organisms like bacteria or single-celled eukaryotes are sensitive to vibrations in the fluid around them. But as far as we know, none of them communicate by sound. Now, it may be that a microbiologist will discover soon that there are, in fact, songs and calls that transmit information through microbial communities. There have been very few studies of this. But the state of knowledge today says that for these single-cell creatures, sound is not the primary means of communication at all. Instead, communication happens through chemical means. And that makes sense in a microbial community where creatures are very close together and chemical communication can transmit very, very quickly over such short distances. But the lack of sonic communication continued with the first multicellular animals to evolve on planet Earth. The great explosion of animal diversity between about 650 and 400 million years ago. We have no evidence of any sound-making device on any fossilized animal. Sound, of course, doesn't fossilize, but we can see structures on the exoskeleton or the endoskeleton or the soft tissues of animals that could create sound. There are none of them in the first few 100 million years of animal evolution. And these animals, like the trilobites, early fish, the progenitors of the vertebrates, other arthropods, these animals did have sophisticated eyes and limbs and nervous systems and guts and reproductive systems. So there was no shortage of raw material for evolution to craft into devices that could make sound. But it seems that in these early days of animal evolution, life unfolded in communicative silence. Certainly, animals would have made incidental sounds as they swam through the waters or chewed their food, but none sung or called, at least as far as we can tell. Why was this? Well, it's possible that predation kept a lid on the sonic communication for hundreds of millions of years. All the early animals could detect vibrations in water, and later for animals on water, and later for animals in the air on land, could detect vibrations in air and in the solid matter of land. They had sensitive hairs on their skin and carapaces that made them aware of the movements of water around them, including low-frequency sounds. Some, such as the fish and cephalopods and also some arthropods, evolved sophisticated inner ears or sensors in the joints, in the limb joints, that could pick up very subtle vibrations. Therefore, the predators on the early Earth, the first predators to evolve, had a good sense of hearing. And therefore, to sing or to call was to invite death. And to this day, defenseless or slow-moving animals are generally silent. Jellyfish and snails and worms and salamanders, these are mostly silent beings. The species that sing are creatures that can fly away from danger rapidly or defend themselves vigorously. These vocal species include birds and flying insects and jumping frogs, fast and well-defended fish, and marine invertebrates such as spiny lobsters and crabs. And the same was true for the first creatures in the fossil record that we have a record of that could make sounds. They were the flying insects and the spiny lobsters and other creatures that could get away from predators. So predation kept a lid on sonic communication for hundreds of millions of years until the evolution of flight and of rapid swimming and other means to escape from predation. Now, the first singers on planet Earth in the terrestrial realm were likely winged creatures that probably looked a little bit like crickets from about 280 million years ago. In the oceans, spiny lobsters or ancient fish, like the ancestors of sturgeon, might have been the first singers. And after these early hesitant starts to sonic communication, the evolution of sound accelerated. Earth songs became more and more diverse, especially in places where visual or chemical communication was difficult or impossible. Sound became a very important unifying communicative force within ecosystems. Think of places today where the vegetation is very dense, or river waters or waters in the nearshore ocean where there's so much turbidity that fish and whales and other creatures can't see more than a body length in front of them. These are places where sonic communication are very useful. And of course, at nighttime, visual signals, unless you're bioluminescent, are useless. And so sound, again, is very useful to link nighttime nocturnal organisms into communicative networks. So many ecosystems today are, of course, extremely rich in sound, with varied soundscapes, both night and day. And we might ask, what caused this great diversity of sound? After all, if the function of a sound is just to send a simple signal like, "I'm here," or "stay out of my territory," then a simple call or a grunt would suffice. But instead we hear a world filled with marvelously diverse sounds. Many factors contribute to this great diversification, and those factors give us a hint at how life evolves and diversifies. First, sounds, the diversity of sounds, reflects the physical diversity of the world. Birds that sing in dense forests tend to have very slow, whistled, melodious songs. These are the kinds of songs whose sound waves transmit without too much degradation within dense vegetation. Sound, of course, bounces off of leaves and tree trunks. But birds that live in open country away from dense vegetation tend to sing not with slow, whistled, melodious songs, but with rapid whistles and trills, virtuosic displays that can pass from the bird's mouth to the ears of listeners unimpeded by the reflections and reverberations imparted by dense reverberation within forests. And I'll play you one example here. This is what we'll hear is the sound of, these are birds in North America, the sound of a summer tanager, which is a bird of dense forest. And listen to how it has a very slow whistled melody. These are the sounds that transmit well within the forest. And then we'll hear the lark sparrow. This is a bird of open prairies without dense vegetation, and it sings with a rapid series of trills and up and downs. Excuse me while I share my screen here. So I hope you could hear the contrast in those sounds, and I apologize for the delay in sharing there. My screen sharing was giving me a little trouble. You can hear the contrast between those two sounds. Very rapid trills for the second species that lives in open country, and much slower, more melodious whistling from the first species. And this is an example of a more general phenomenon that within the sounds of each species, we have the imprint of the habitat in which it lives. This is true also of fish and whale sounds in the oceans. They're adapted to either the crash and tumult of the shore or to transmission through the deep sound channels in the open ocean. Each species fits its song to its habitat. And this is true even in the vibrational world of sound waves flowing through solid matter. For example, many insects don't communicate so much through the air, but they stand on the twig, and my finger here is the twig, one insect standing on one end, and it makes vibrations that it passes down through its legs into the twig. Those sound vibrations pass through the solid matter of the twig to another insect standing at the other end, and so they communicate by passing sound through wood or leaves, or the petioles of leaves, the stalks of leaves. And it turns out that the sound that the insects make is adapted to the sonic transmission qualities of the wood or the leaf on which they stand. So as we listen to the varied sounds of the world around us, we're hearing a living manifestation of the physical variability of the world. And another source of diversity, sonic diversity in ecosystems, is the need to avoid acoustic competition between species. If every single insect and bird sang at the same time and at the same frequency, they'd smother one another's sounds. So instead, some of them divide up the acoustic spectrum, finding their own channel, their own timing and pacing through which to communicate with others. And this is particularly evident in subtropical and particularly in tropical forests, where we might have hundreds of species vocalizing all at once. I'll share one example here. This is from dawn in the Amazon rainforest. And here we'll hear the incredible diversity of sounds, and note how the species singing will hear insects and also primates and birds all singing together. They've divided up the spectrum, some singing high and some singing low. So I hope you could hear a little bit of that sonic diversity there. Go out into the forest to hear a little more. One challenge with Zoom, of course, is that the audio on Zoom is optimized for the human voice, and so it tends to just pick out the frequencies that humans speak at. and the higher pitched insects and some of the lower creatures like howler monkeys don't come through on the audio. And so a reminder for us all to soak our ears and bodies in the voice of the living earth, unmediated by electronics, as a way of restoring the full capacity of our hearing. Now, predation can also act as a diversifying force in sonic evolution. By sounding different from other species, prey animals can escape the attention of predators. How? Because predators tend to learn the common sounds around them and home in on them to find their prey. Sonic rarity, in other words, not sounding like the other creatures around you, can be an advantage. It keeps you safe. And this provides an impetus for the diversification of sounds through evolution within ecosystems. Many sounds also, of course, serve as mating displays, communicating the location, the identity, and the quality of the singer. And the aesthetic evolution that comes with sexual selection then comes into play, further diversifying sounds. Slight differences in the songs of closely related species, or even of subpopulations within these same species, can rapidly diverge from one another due to the aesthetic preferences of males and females within each subpopulation. Sexuality and its many extravagances is therefore a creative force for sonic evolution, just as it is for visual displays, such as the bright feather displays of birds. Now, this great sonic diversity of the world acts as a glue that holds together many ecosystems. Sound, therefore, allows ecosystems to be more productive and resilient and creative. Why is this? The connections that create possibilities. Think of all the animals that exist within a dense forest. Many of these animals depend on sound for the success of their lives. Sound helps them to find food. Sound is the foundation of their breeding systems. Parents and offspring communicate through sound. Competitors mediate the interactions among them within the ecosystem through sound. The soundscape also indicates changing environmental conditions such as weather or the changing seasons. And without sonic communication, it's no exaggeration to say that many of these species could not exist within these ecosystems. And therefore, the ecosystem functions that they provide would not be possible, such as fruit dispersal, pollination, herbivory, predation, nutrient cycling. The forest exists in part because of sound. The same is true in coral reefs. The same is true in grasslands. Sound, as I said at the beginning, is a neurotransmitter that keeps many of the functions of ecosystems intact. And it follows, therefore, that if we fragment the sound, if we lose voices within ecosystems, if we smother them with human-generated noise, we diminish the capacity of life, the resilience of life within those ecosystems. And we often think of the sensory world as ephemeral and somehow as less important than the so-called more fundamental things like genetics and the flow of atoms through ecosystems. But life is made from connection. Without connection, death ensues. The senses connect. The senses, sound especially, are therefore a central part of the vitality and the future of ecosystems. The sonic diversity of ecosystems has practical uses also for conservation scientists. For decades, we've assessed the health and vitality of ecosystems using acoustic surveys, such as bird counts, conducted by specialists taking nothing but their well-trained ears and a notebook into the field. These venerable field methods have lately been supplemented by the use of digital technology. We can now deploy microphones in ecosystems and record sounds for hours, or sometimes even months at a time. This vast amount of data can then be analyzed through the use of computer algorithms that either seek out the calls of individual species, a form of pattern recognition, or by looking for overall statistical trends in sonic data. For example, we can assess using statistical software how different types of forest management affect overall sonic complexity within an ecosystem. This gives us insights through sound into the functioning and diversity of these ecosystems, insights that would be very hard to get through other means, because sound reveals the identity and the presence of species in a way that's much faster and easier to gather that data than sending dozens or hundreds of people out into ecosystems to make the same assessments. These methods are sometimes called passive acoustic monitoring, and have the great advantage of being relatively unintrusive and not harmful to animals that are being studied, in contrast to more hands-on methods that require catching and manipulating living animals. But the passive nature of the recording also carries with it a danger. And that danger is that we will become experts in microphones and statistical software, but forget to use our own ears and to listen using our own bodies to the many stories and wonders of the living world. A complement to technology has to be renewed emphasis on the wisdom that comes from lived experience. This lived experience is that of professional scientific researchers, of course, but also, and more importantly, the lived experience of the people who live within ecosystems that scientists study. There are great stores of cultural knowledge and understanding that should be honored, listened to, and acted on as a complement to technological or statistical forms of knowledge. There are multiple forms of science, of knowing the world through curiosity. And the ecological crisis that we live within demands that we listen to all of them. The sonic diversity of the world also offers us a way of communicating with people for whom conservation science might at first seem irrelevant or uninteresting. It turns out that human beings have amazing sonic memory, and these sonic memories are tied to emotion. Perhaps because we communicate so much through spoken language, our brains are excellent at remembering sounds. Our long-term memory for sound is much better, for example, than those of our close primate cousins. Therefore, people have a subconscious attachment to their homes or their places of origin through sounds. These sounds might be the particular sounds of a city street, or of a farm field or a forest, depending on where we grew up. Regardless of the kind of sound, these memories of the sounds of our homes stick with us for decades. And if we hear these sounds later in life, we're reminded of how the world used to be. This provides an opportunity for storytelling and connection. For example, I remember my grandfather, who's now passed away, telling me how the sounds of agricultural areas in the 1930s, where he grew up, were completely different than the sounds even by the time of the 1970s and 1980s when I knew him. Many of the birds that he remembered as a young boy in the fields where he grew up could no longer be heard. This was a result of the massive changes in agriculture in rural England where he lived. This story of diminishment has stuck with me through the decades. Why? Because the story came from a trusted and loved family member. He transmitted to me a sonic memory of a time decades before I was born. And since then, I've looked at hundreds of graphs of bird populations, both declines and increases, both in the UK and from data all around the world. But none of these graphs, none of these data, as magnificent as they are, have stuck with me with the same power and the same deepness in my memory as that story from my grandfather. And this suggests a reason why we might listen carefully in the present moment. By listening, we ground ourselves in the sensory reality of the present moment. and we gain information that we can relay to the future. Our children, grandchildren, students, and neighbors will need our stories in the future. If we listen and pay attention now, we will have stories that carry within them important messages about the nature of the changing world. We will inoculate the future in part against the myths of the shifting baseline, where we're born into a diminished world and we don't realize the diminishment because we didn't listen, because we didn't live through it. And the messages, these stories that we tell, will carry weight because they come from people who are paying attention with their senses in the present moment. So my call is for us to listen now, to smell the aromas of trees and of city streets now. Almost guaranteed these things will change in coming years. And if we have paid attention in the present moment, we can tell something to the future. We also then need to listen to our elders, the people who do remember the times from the 1930s and 1950s, years ago, of what the life was like then. And then also listen to the stories that come from deeper time, from those who have been dead for centuries, that come to us through our cultures, about what the nature of the world was. And so connection to the embodied experience of the senses in the present day presents a way of cross-generational connection and of sharing information through space and time. And so I will conclude with an invitation to you. And that invitation is to pick a place somewhere where you live now and return to that place repeatedly over the coming weeks, just to listen. This practice takes just a few minutes, but it yields great insights. By returning again and again to the same place, with enthusiastically open senses, we befriend that place. We come to know it. We come to know its sensory richness and variations and subtleties, both in its beauty and in its brokenness. These become known to us. This direct connection with life is a source of personal renewal and meaning, and often of joy. And listening can also be a great stimulus to curiosity. Curiosity is the foundation of all good science. What questions arise from the sounds that you hear at your place? How do the sounds of the place intersect with the questions that you already had within you as you arrived? You might also consider inviting a friend on this listening foray, sharing the sensory richness of the living world with another. We live in an age where we are saturated with an ever-increasing flow of PDFs and citations and messages from social media and stories arriving, mediated often by the manipulative algorithms of the electronic world. Listening can rejoin us to the sensory richness of the living world as it is, and reorient us back to truths that emerge when we take the time to listen to what the other species on this planet have to tell us. And with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I would be delighted to take any questions as they've come through the Slack channel.
Professor Haskell, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I mean, like you say, biologists have been using sound for a long, long time to identify species or count individuals. But this is something, what you talked about is something that I think most of us have not thought about. And I guess it's going to be an eye-opener or an ear-opener for a lot of the participants at SCCS-Bengaluru 2022. So thank you so much. You put in your questions to Professor Haskell in the Slack channel for the plenary here, and we already have a topic And I think most of us will echo this completely. So absolutely thrilled to be listening to your talk, Professor Haskell. Your work has been an inspiration, continues to be a source of strength for those of us trying to highlight the role of sound in influencing and in maintaining biocultural diversity. And I was really struck, at least by sound as being potentially a vehicle for memory, and how sound is so useful in transmitting from generation to generation, both to the natural world and to the human world, just memory and connectivity. So thank you so much. We have a question here from Kirti, and he asks, what do you think could be the reasons for the dawn chorus, which has been the subject of so much debate?
Yeah, so thank you. Well, and thank you for the kind words about sound as memory. And I mean, we understand this very well within musical traditions, right? So music connects one generation to another and is always changing. And that's part of the delight of music, is the tension between innovation and tradition that happens within music all over the world. And the challenge now is to expand our appreciation and cross-cultural connection to the music of the living world as well, beyond the human. So in terms of the dawn chorus, yes, so this is the surge in bird song that occurs right around dawn. And this happens in many different ecosystems. It's extraordinary. I mean, in tropical forests, we have a dawn chorus, but also high up near the Arctic or in temperate forests or grasslands, there seems to be a surge in bird activity there. And there are a number of hypotheses about why that might be. And my understanding is that there is no single answer to this, and then this is an area of active debate. But some leading hypotheses are: first, during the dawn, often environmental conditions for sound transmission are very good. So the air tends to be fairly still. The disturbances in the air caused by heat during the day have not built up, and so sound will transmit much longer, much further distance, but also with less degradation. So there's a physical reason there. Another might be is that many birds don't know exactly what's going to happen in the night, how cold it's going to be, whether they're going to need to escape from a predator. And so they will overcompensate for that uncertainty by eating a little bit more food than they need just technically to get through the night. And so they wake up in the morning with a little bit more energy stores, which gives them the opportunity then to take time away from feeding and to sing. Another thing about the dawn chorus is that it's a very bird phenomenon. I mean, some tropical primates, a few insects are part of the dawn chorus. But birds are very visual as well. And I think as the darkness falls away, territoriality and territorial interactions really ramp up. The birds are no longer roosting, they're figuring out territorial boundaries, they're trying to find mates and to reconnect with their offspring. So there's this time in which it becomes vital to communicate your presence and to connect with others. So I think there may also be a social reason as well that might indicate, why it's birds that have a dawn chorus, not so much frogs that tend to be much more nocturnal animals, of course. So the dawn isn't a time of renewal of territoriality. So those are a few ideas, hypotheses, and speculations, but excellent question. So.
Thank you. We have another question from Kirti Sudarshan, who asks, with its changing ecosystem and increased anthropological influence, he has two questions, in fact. One, would bird calls change drastically? And two, how long would it take for this to evolve in organisms?
Yes, of course, so anthropogenic changes produced a couple of things. And one is, in some ecosystems, lots of extra noise around industrial urban areas. In other places, because we're causing species population declines and even the extinctions, we're having a loss of the diversity of sound. So it's sort of the paradox: in some places too much sound, and in other places a loss of sound. But in the places with too much sound, it's pretty clear that that sound blocks the communication channel for some species, so they cannot continue their social lives, and those species are therefore excluded from those ecosystems. But some will adapt physiologically, and this isn't so much an evolutionary adaptation as an adaptation in the moment, a behavioral adaptation where the species sing louder and they sing at a higher pitch, which allows their sounds to get over the urban noise, over the noise of industry, and to be heard. But even with those compensations, the range of sonic communication among the individuals within the population is reduced, and the stress level within the birds that have been studied has gone up. Even in the nest, little bird nestlings in the nest that are exposed to excess urban noise show shortened telomeres, which is a genetic signal of stress in the body and of premature aging. So urban sounds actually, they affect adult birds, but they're also affecting nestling birds. And the adaptation there is very quick, and that we had an interesting example of this with the lockdowns that happened in 2020 with COVID. Lots less traffic noise, and there are some studies coming out now that show that birds in urban areas actually changed their voices. They reverted to the way they used to sing back, say, in the 1950s when things weren't quite so noisy. And in some places, say in the around San Francisco and California, where there are sound recordings of birds from all those decades ago, 70 years ago now, showing that there was a rather quick reversion. So this isn't so much an evolutionary change, it's a change with birds listening and changing behaviorally. But of course, over time, with large enough bird populations, indeed the birds will evolve in the way that they have, say, by evolving different wing shapes and dietary preferences in urban environments quite rapidly over just a few generations.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's not actually an evolutionary change, but it's actually a plastic change within the lifetime of an organism, which is very, very interesting. We have a very interesting question here, which is we study the effect of anthropogenic noise on other creatures, but what about its effect on ourselves? And acoustic warfare has even been in the news recently. I'd like to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, acoustic warfare would be an extreme version of that. But in a way, we are conducting that warfare every day in our cities. And there's very good evidence that when we're exposed to unwanted and uncontrollable noise, like if we live near to a rail line and we get woken up in the night by rail cars going past, or next to a busy urban highway and so on, even if we're used to the sound, that sound disturbs us, it increases our blood pressure, actually inflames us from within, and produces things like diabetes and heart disease. And so it's not just an inconvenience or an annoyance. Noise pollution within cities has a very direct and negative effect on human physiology. It also affects how children learn. And there are good examples of studies of this showing that children who are in very noisy classrooms with lots of, say, a busy roadway or elevated rail track nearby have their attention fragmented. They're not able to concentrate as much. They don't remember as well. So noise pollution affects how we learn and develop as well as our physiology. So this is a form of warfare that unfortunately we are conducting now, but we know how to mitigate at least some of those changes through careful urban planning. And unfortunately, at least in the US and some parts of and in some other countries, I don't know the history of urban planning in other countries quite so well. There have been policies that have directed industry and busy roads through vulnerable communities, minority communities, low-income communities. And so this burden of urban noise has been imposed more on some parts of society than on others, so it becomes a form of environmental injustice. And this is, of course, environmental injustice in urban areas gets locked in the structure of cities, but then can be changed moving forward through more enlightened building and urban policies. In terms of actual warfare, that indeed, because the human body is so sensitive to sound, and sound is so hard to block out, that weapons that are built around sound can be devastating. And I know the police in the United States have used these through trying to disperse crowds with extremely loud noises and things that actually can result in permanent hearing damage. So that there's a problem there. But yes, we are very sensitive to sound. You know, there's a paradox there, because a certain amount of urban noise, if you've grown up in the city, is the sound of home, and you like it, and when it goes away, you miss it. So it's not that all human sounds are bad. It's just that in some situations, uncontrolled and unwanted sounds can be a problem. Oh, you're muted there, Umesh.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm saying we would love to keep talking about this, because this is such a fascinating new perspective on sound. But I'm afraid we have time for only one more question, and that is from Veda. And he says, it was an amazing talk, and he asked, what are your views on the artificial sounds, particularly playback, used to attract animals for any purpose, and what would be the effects of those?
Yes, and of course this is used in tourism but also in scientific studies. And I think my understanding of the data, and I had a student of mine worked on this question, is that small amounts of playbacks add a certain amount of inconvenience and stress to the organisms that are subjected to them. If it's a critically endangered species, of course, that could make the difference. If it's a more common species, it's not such a conservation problem. Repeated use of playbacks on the same individual, those individuals sometimes get acclimated to that sound and start ignoring it and tuning it out. And so this is an area where there have not been that many controlled studies of this. It seems to me that it could potentially be a problem. But in another way, that some of these vocal creatures are very good at distinguishing between sounds that are relevant to their lives and those that are not, and will actually learn to ignore some of the playbacks. But certainly for species that are subject to repeated playbacks, that are already suffering from many challenges in their lives, this could be problematic. But the occasional playback is, I think I'm fairly safe in saying it will not be damaging. I have a colleague who actually says it boosts the ego of the creatures that receive the playback, because they think, oh, there was a playback and then it went away, so I must have chased those away. That's a humorous speculation, not a real scientific point. But yeah, thank you.
Well, very, very unfortunately, we are now out of time. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Haskell, for
thank you.
It's talk with so many great insights. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you. It's an honor. I wish you all well.
We do have other questions on the Slack channel, so we would request you, if you can, to take a look at those at some point over the course of the conference. And if you can, please do answer those questions in the Slack channel for your plenary. And participants, please do continue to post questions for Professor Haskell. I'm sure he will be happy to engage with all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up today's session at SCCS-Bengaluru 2022, day 1. But we start at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and we have a very, very fascinating set of talks and sessions. We start with the plenary by Dr. Dolly Keaton, and we have poster presentations, we have workshops, we have a number of very, very interesting sessions happening tomorrow. So please do tune in onto the Slack channel tomorrow and do participate and be part of SCCS. Thank you all for joining us on day 1, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for day 2.